Hi, this is Deb Wenger. Today we're going to talk about media on a global scale. It's chapter 15 in your textbook, and you see here that I've opened with a logo for Al Jazeera. So for those of you who don't know, Al Jazeera is an Arab media organization based out of Qatar, and it offers a unique perspective at times on occurrences happening around the world. Just as you might get a different point of view from watching CNN or BBC, Al Jazeera brings a different perspective to the table. So what's interesting is Al Jazeera English is a network that's operating here in the US, and it's relatively difficult to find on American cable and satellite systems. So many people who watch the programming actually watch it on computers or via mobile devices. And this is, in a sense, an example of ownership effects. You remember we talked about that in chapter 2. So the idea that U.S. cable companies were able to prevent Al Jazeera from being broadcast on cable systems because of their concerns that people would find the Al Jazeera point of view offensive. So basically, the company said, we don't really want to mess with this. We don't think there's going to be a huge audience for this programming. So why should we create headaches for ourselves by providing this content? So in this way, there's a type of censorship going on. We are not being allowed to view programming, not our government censoring, but essentially our media companies making it harder for us to consume this content. Now, of course, you can make the argument that the web helps us bypass that, and certainly Al Jazeera English is available online, and the people who are interested can find a way often to view it. But it is an interesting look at how media may not be quite as free as we sometimes think it is here in the US, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the lecture. So there are 4 theories of the press that were developed in the 1950s, and much of the chapter centers on these 4 theories. So the first one is the Libertarian Theory. So under this view of how media is organized and structured, the Libertarian Theory suggests that people really want to know the truth, and they want to make decisions based on what information they believe to be true. And the idea goes on to say that the only way to get at the truth is for us to openly and freely discuss ideas. So, if you think about the founders of our country and freedom of speech, that's what this is all about. That if we can talk it through, if we can discuss it, if everybody can bring their points of view to the table, that we can come up with the best path, the best decision, the most truthful understanding of events. So part of it says that different people are going to have different opinions, and everybody must be allowed to take in information and arrive at their own conclusions. In the Libertarian Theory, the most rational ideas are going to be accepted, because if we just have all the information we need, we will arrive at good decisions. And this also assumes that the government is the greatest threat to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, not corporate interests. So by and large, U.S. media believes itself to be organized under the Libertarian Theory. That it's okay for corporate interests to control, or it's better for corporate interests to control what we consume and what's available to us than it would be to allow our government to tell us what we can view or read or talk about. Another of the 4 theories of the press is Authoritarian Theory. So under Authoritarian Theory, the role of the press is to serve the government, not really serve the people. And media are controlled heavily through governmental regulations. If those don't work, there can be intimidation of individual journalists and editors, and actually force, jailing, beating up, even killing journalists who don't toe the line when it relates to what the government wants published. So you see here, I'm using a photo from North Korea, many, many times considered one, or if not the worst in the world, one of the 3 or 4 worst in the world countries when it comes to press freedom. Another of the 4 theories of the press is communist theory. So you have to think about when these theories were developed. This was in the 1950s when there was still a Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. Under this theory, the media are essentially an instrument of the Communist Party. So independent press is suppressed and media is tied closely to government power. The main purpose of media is to act as a tool for government propaganda. Now, I had a chance to go to China a few years ago and spend quite a bit of time with some Chinese journalists. Certainly, China continues to be under communist rule, but I will say that it's a very interesting environment in which to operate as a journalist. I found for the most part that many subjects that would not officially be allowed to be talked about were talked about. And the problem for journalists in China was more, you don't know you're going to get in trouble until you get in trouble. So it was often self-censorship would occur among Chinese journalists because they didn't want to talk about something that they thought could get them in trouble, even though they weren't 100% sure that it would get them in trouble. Another of the 4 theories of the press is social responsibility theory. So under this theory, the media has to provide the following. Has to provide information needed for the political system to work. So in the US, we talk about the media's role in supporting democracy. And it needs to give people information they need to make their own decisions. So essentially, the information they need to be self-governing. And it needs to serve as a government watchdog. And then, of course, there's a newer theory, as your text talks about, development theory. And under development theory, the idea is that some countries, when they are first becoming industrialized and moving, out of third world conditions, that they may actually need some types of media controls to help boost business, to create a sense of shared national identity. On the other hand, people look at this and say, how is that different than authoritarian controls? And don't you want people to be able to decide for themselves how they want their media to operate? Another way of looking at how media around the world operate is a concept called the 5 dimensions of media. So under the 5 dimensions of media, you ask a series of questions. First, who controls the media? Of course, here in the US, by and large, media is controlled by private industry. In a country like China, you have kind of a mix. You have some government-controlled media, and then you have some privately controlled media. However, even the privately controlled media still has to follow governmental guidelines. Finance. How do broadcasters pay the bills? One of the things that gets talked about a lot when we compare US media to British media, for example, to the BBC, is that people say, well, of course it's easy for the BBC to have great quality programming. Everybody in the country that has a television set has to pay about £145 per year for the privilege of having that TV. So that's money that the BBC can use to create quality programming. The programming goal. So what are the media trying to accomplish with their programming? Is the point governmental propaganda, or is the point to truly inform? Another dimension is the target audience. So who is the media being produced for and distributed to? So if you are trying to reach only the elite of the continent, you might focus your message on television in Africa because in Africa, television is still sort of a rare commodity among rural areas where electricity is still really iffy and sometimes completely impossible to come by. And then how do media organizations hear back from their audiences? Is it an environment in which people are allowed to protest what the media is saying? So the book talks about press freedom, and there's actually an organization, Reporters Without Borders, that does a press freedom index every year. And as far back as I can remember looking at the press index, I would say that Finland, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, as you see there on the right-hand side, that they tend to always be somewhere in that first, second, third, fourth, fifth range. They tend to have very liberal views on how the media should operate, and the government essentially takes a hands-off approach to how content is disseminated, even though the government actually supports media in Norway, for example, financially supports media. They're very good at being hands-off in terms of what kind of content is created. So what about the U.S.? Well, the U.S. is number 49, and it has been dropping in recent years. In 2014, this is the 2015 ranking, but it's based on events from 2014. A couple of reasons why the U.S. dropped in ranking involved a couple of things involving the government and its response to situations. So one of the things cited in the report about the way the U.S. arrived at its ranking of number 49, a New York Times reporter was harassed, according to Reporters Without Borders, in court for quoting material provided to him by a CIA officer who was then charged with violation of the Espionage Act. And as many as 15 journalists jailed during the Ferguson protest coverage, jailed for apparently no good reason. So you look back at the index, you notice the colors sort of indicate where the country falls in terms of openness and freedom. You'll notice Canada, right above us, actually ranks quite a bit higher than we do, ranks number 8 in the world. You'll notice, we've pointed out before, China, North Korea, this country right here I think is pronounced Eritrea. I believe that is considered to be the least open in terms of journalism in the world at this time. So, global differences, we've talked about a few of them. Canada actually has rules about how much Canadian content must be broadcast. You know, they often import content from the U.S., and we're so concerned about the U.S. kind of taking over their cultural identity. They require broadcasters, for example, to include a certain percentage of Canadian programming. We've already talked about BBC gets government subsidies through TV license fees, and that's actually something that is going to probably pop up in the news over the next couple of years, because I believe it's 2016 that the current kind of rules about how much people have to pay in the UK for television are going to be revisited. And a lot of people are saying it's ridiculous in this day and age to require this fee. Newspaper circulation, we talk a lot about the decline in newspaper circulation here in the US. It's actually growing in Asia and Latin America, and part of that is the rise of the middle class, more people becoming literate, and so newspapers continue to be much more robust in other parts of the world. Radio is the most important medium in Africa. You know, we talk about how little news there is on radio today. It's just the opposite in Africa. That's where most people get their news. Eastern Bloc countries, interestingly, I was in Slovakia a few years ago and was amazed at something, and I hope I will say this word correctly, Zakazura? Zakajuka? Zakajuka? Eastern Bloc countries, you can still buy news coverage. So you can actually go to a newspaper and say, I want you to say how wonderful my new restaurant is. Please write a glowing review. And the newspaper will say, absolutely, here's how much it costs. So all of these differences, I think, are important for anyone who is hoping to work in business that might have an international reach, or hoping to work in marketing. Certainly understanding cultural differences is going to be important, and understanding if you're going to operate in Africa, you might create a fabulous web campaign, but who's it going to reach? If you create a terrific radio campaign, you might make a much bigger impact. So that's the point of discussing all of these dimensions. And of course, the world is getting smaller, right? Our ability to monitor what's happening in other parts of the world has never been greater, from being able to watch Arab Spring unfold via Twitter to the massive amounts of coverage that were dedicated to the events involving the satirical French magazine Charlie Hebdo. For those of you who may not know the story, in early January 2015, 12 people were killed and 11 injured at the offices of the magazine. The violence is believed to have been in response to a series of cartoons featuring the Prophet Muhammad. Of course, those who follow the Islamic religion believe that it is blasphemy to use any kind of image of Muhammad. And in this case, these cartoons portrayed him in very much an unflattering light. Interestingly, following the violence, there was a lot of controversy here in the U.S. media about whether or not they should republish the cartoons, and most major U.S. news outlets chose not to. There were a couple of exceptions, especially in online publications, but most of the editors that I read talking about the issue said that there's no reason to publish something that you know is going to be offensive. At the same time, millions of people in France rallied in support of free speech and against violence in the aftermath of this event. The world is getting smaller, and media is more permeable, crossing borders more easily than ever before. And so at least creating a heightened sense of the impact of media on the world and on individuals and on societies is critical for you, regardless of what field you go into. So I'd be interested to see some tweets related to this topic. Remember, the hashtag to use is UMJOUR101.